14 years, or perhaps it was 16. The chronometer in deck tertiary 9-7 failed sometime before I was born, and no one from the upper sections ever descended far enough to repair it. Time became something we measured in shift rotations and the cooling cycles of the primary bilge pumps. I mark my age by the number of times I have seen men freeze to death in their sleep. 43. 43 times I have logged the body, stripped it of anything useful, and fed the remains into the reclamation chute. The number feels precise when I state it. I have no way to verify its accuracy. The cold is constant. Not the cold of ice or winter, I have never experienced either, but the cold of massive metal structures suspended in the void, insulated only enough to prevent the air itself from freezing solid. 31 degrees at the warmest points near the pump housings, 18 degrees in the sleeping corridors. The temperature differential creates condensation that freezes on every surface, thin layers of frost that we scrape off and melt for drinking water when the rationing gets tight. The cold makes metal brittle. It makes flesh brittle, too. I watched Cale, or was it Carol? I archived the sound but never saw it written. I watched him snap 3 fingers on his left hand, trying to grip a wrench that had been sitting in the open air for half a shift. The bones just fractured. Clean breaks. He wrapped them and continued working. We all did. I was born in the lower decks. My mother, I have a memory of her face, though the details corrupt when I attempt to retrieve them, worked the tertiary coolant lines until a pipe burst and flash froze everything in a 12-meter radius. I was 4 shifts old. Standard procedure dictated that I be sent to reclamation, but Venn claimed me. He needed small hands for the intake filters. That is how continuation works in the lower decks. You are useful, or you are protein. There is no third category. The first memory I can retrieve with clarity is the sound. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the bilge pumps that move millions of liters of contaminated coolant, waste runoff, and condensation through the ship's lower circulatory systems. The sound is not loud. It is foundational. You feel it through the deck plating before you hear it. 4 beats, then a pause, then 4 beats again. The pulse of the ship. I learned to sleep in rhythm with it. When the rhythm changes, something has gone wrong. When the rhythm stops, everyone in the section dies. That knowledge was the first lesson. Everything else built from there. Venn taught me the first principle of lower deck survival during my 3rd year of functional consciousness. We were working on bilge pump 7, the one that services the aft waste reclamation systems. He held my hand against the pump housing, warm, almost hot compared to the ambient air, and said, "This machine does not care if you live. The ship does not care if you live. The only thing that keeps you breathing is that stopping this pump costs the officers more than feeding you." He released my hand. I had a blister. I did not mention it. He continued, "Make yourself useful to the pump. The pump makes you useful to the ship. That is all you will ever be." I understood. I was 6 years old by my best estimate. I understood completely. The lower decks extend for kilometers in every direction. Deck, tertiary 9-7, is one node in a network of access ways, pump stations, coolant reservoirs, and maintenance corridors that form the foundation of the ship's operational infrastructure. No one I have ever met has seen the full schematic. We know our section. We know the pumps we service. We know the routes to the protein dispensary and the reclamation chutes. Everything beyond that is conjecture, passed down through generations of men who have never left the lower decks. Venn said his grandfather worked these same pumps, his grandfather's father before that. The ship has been operational for so long that the concept of it ever not existing makes no sense. This is the universe. Cold metal, darkness, the rhythm of pumps. There is nothing else. We are not crew. We are infrastructure personnel. There is a difference. Crew members have designations, ranks, bunks in heated sections. We have gang affiliations and territory. Ven's gang controlled the bilge pump maintenance for decks tertiary 9-6 through 9-9, 23 men at its peak, 16 by the time I was old enough to hold a wrench without dropping it. The attrition was constant but manageable. Accidents mostly. Hypothermia. Occasionally a territorial dispute with the gangs that controlled the coolant lines or the air recycling nodes. Violence was inefficient. Everyone knew it, but protein rations were finite, and when distribution failed for 3 or 4 cycles, men made decisions that prioritized immediate survival over long-term stability. I learned the pumps the way other men learn language. Bilge Pump 7 had a specific vibration pattern in its tertiary bearing housing that indicated imminent seal failure. You could feel it if you placed your palm flat against the casing. A slight irregularity in the rhythm, like a heartbeat, with an extra half-beat that should not be there. Bilge Pump 4 ran hot on its primary intake valve and required manual monitoring every 3rd cycle. The valve would stick if the temperature differential exceeded 8 degrees, and unsticking it required a specific sequence. Bleed the pressure. Apply penetrating oil to the seal junction. Wait exactly 90 seconds for thermal equalization. Then apply torque in short bursts rather than sustained pressure. I learned this by watching Ven work it 17 times before he let me attempt it myself. When I did it correctly on the first attempt, he said nothing. Silence was approval. Bilge Pump 12, the largest in our section, a structure 3 stories tall with coolant pipes as wide as a man's torso. Bilge Pump 12 was older than anyone alive. Ven said it had been installed during the ship's original construction, whenever that was. Centuries at minimum, possibly longer. The machine had outlived generations of men. It would outlive me. I accepted this as operational fact. The pump was sacred in a way I had no proper words for. Not sacred in the sense of devotion. We did not pray to it or offer it anything but maintenance, but sacred in the sense that it was the reason we existed. Without Pump 12, the lower decks would flood with waste coolant in less than 6 hours. Everyone would drown or freeze. The pump was survival. We were its attendants. I remember the first time I was allowed inside Pump 12's main housing. I was 9 years old and had demonstrated sufficient competency with the smaller pumps. Ven needed someone small enough to access the secondary impeller chamber. The access port was 60 centimeters wide. Most men could not fit. I could. He handed me a light, a small handheld unit powered by a cell that would last maybe 30 minutes, and told me to inspect the impeller blades for stress fractures. I climbed inside. The sound was different in there. The 4-beat rhythm was all around me, inside me, vibrating through my bones. The chamber was warm, at 40 degrees, maybe more. I could see my breath, but it did not freeze. The impeller blades were enormous up close, each one taller than I was, spinning at speeds that would shred a human body instantly if the pump were operational. But it was shut down for maintenance. The blades were still. I ran my hands along the leading edges, feeling for cracks. The metal was smooth, old, worn down by centuries of moving contaminated fluid. I found 3 hairline fractures. I marked them with a grease pencil. Ven hauled me out after 28 minutes. He inspected my marks. He nodded. That was the day I became a real part of the gang. I had been useful to Pump 12. Protein distribution occurred every 8 shifts. The dispensary was a reinforced hatch in the bulkhead, at the intersection of 3 territorial zones, neutral ground by necessity. You presented yourself at the hatch when the chime sounded. You received your block. You left immediately. The blocks were gray, dense, and tasted like nothing. 200 grams, sufficient to sustain basic metabolic function if you rationed it carefully and did not exert yourself beyond the minimum required for pump maintenance. Most men ate half immediately and saved the rest. I learned to eat exactly 60 grams per shift, 4 shifts worth of ration spread across 8. It meant constant hunger. It also meant I never experienced the crashes that came from depleting your ration early and waiting 4 shifts with nothing. The hunger was its own presence, not pain exactly, but a background awareness that never went away. After the first few years, you stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the cold. It was simply the baseline, the normal state. I watched new men arrive in our section and struggle with the rations. They would eat too much too fast, then suffer for it. Some did not adapt. They would grow weak, make mistakes, lose fingers or hands to equipment malfunctions caused by diminished reaction time. Ven did not tolerate incompetence. If you could not adapt to the rations, you went to reclamation. The gang could not afford to carry liabilities. There was a period, I think I was 10 years old, when distribution failed completely for 16 shifts, a malfunction in the upper deck logistics systems. No explanation was provided. The chime did not sound. The hatch did not open. Men began to make decisions. The gangs met in the neutral zone and established protocols. Each gang would inventory its reserves. Sharing would occur on a strict barter system. Tools for rations, labor for rations, information for rations. Ven's gang had 96 grams in reserve total, spread across 16 men. That was 6 grams per person. Enough to prevent complete metabolic shutdown. Not enough to work effectively. Pump maintenance could not stop. If the pumps failed, distribution failure would not matter, because everyone would be dead. So we worked. I remember the shaking in my hands on the 4th shift without rations. The way my vision would narrow at the edges when I stood up too quickly. Johan collapsed on the 6th shift. We dragged him to the pump 12 housing, where it was warmest, and left him there to recover. He did. On the 9th shift, someone from the Poolant Line gang tried to raid the neutral zone dispensary. They brought cutting tools and tried to force the hatch. Ven and 4 others stopped them. 3 men died. The bodies went to reclamation immediately. No one commented on the efficiency of the timing. Distribution resumed on the 16th shift. The hatch opened. The blocks were there, 200 grams each, as always. No explanation, no apology. The system had malfunctioned. The system had corrected itself. We collected our rations and returned to normal operations. I ate my 60 grams and felt the edge of the hunger dull slightly. Ven gathered the gang afterward and said, "This will happen again. We start keeping larger reserves. 10% of every ration goes into storage. 10% of 200 grams is 20 grams. That meant eating 180 grams every 8 shifts. The hunger deepened, but we accumulated reserves. When distribution failed again 2 years later, only 8 shifts that time, we had enough stored to prevent collapse. That was the nature of survival in the lower decks. Constant calculation. Constant deprivation in service of future deprivation slightly less severe. There was no surplus. There was no comfort. There was only the narrow margin between functional and non-functional, and you defended that margin with everything you had. The first time I saw the upper sections was an accident. I was 12, maybe 13. A coolant leak in the primary distribution line required tracing back to the source. Ven assigned me the task because I was still small enough to fit through the access crawlways. I followed the line upward, always upward. The ship's architecture was oriented around gravity that I did not fully understand yet, through sections I had never accessed before. The temperature increased. 18 degrees became 22, then 26. I removed my outer layer because I was sweating. Sweating. I did not know the body could do that. I emerged into a corridor that had light, not the dim red emergency lighting of the lower decks, but actual illumination. White. Clean. The walls were painted. I stood in the crawlway access hatch and stared. A man walked past. An officer, I realized, though I had never seen one, and did not acknowledge my existence. To him, I was a component of the ship's infrastructure, briefly visible, immediately irrelevant. He wore a uniform that was clean. His face was not scarred by frostbite. His hands had all their fingers. He walked with purpose towards something that mattered to him, and I was not part of that equation in any capacity. I wanted to step out into the corridor, to feel the warmth fully, to see what else existed in the lighted sections. But I understood instinctively that my presence there would be noted, and notation would lead to questions, and questions would lead to reassignment or reclamation. I completed the repair and returned to Tertiary 97. The temperature dropped with each meter I descended. By the time I reached familiar territory, I was shaking from the cold again. Venn asked if I had identified the leak. I confirmed. He asked nothing else. I never mentioned the light or the painted walls or the officer who walked past without seeing me. Some knowledge is not useful. Knowing that the upper sections existed in warmth and light while we froze in the dark did not change the fact that we froze in the dark. It only added weight to the knowledge of what we would never have. But I thought about it. During the sleeping shifts, lying on my metal bunk with frost forming on the blanket, I would replay the memory. The white light, the painted walls, the warmth that made your body sweat instead of shiver. I thought about it until the details began to corrupt. Then I stopped retrieving the memory intentionally. I archived it. I let it degrade. Tam entered my awareness during my 14th year of function. I am certain of this timeline because it was the same cycle that Bilge Pump 4 suffered a catastrophic seal failure and required full disassembly. The repair took 60 continuous shifts. Tam was assigned to our gang as replacement for Johan, who had disappeared into reclamation after losing 3 fingers to frostbite and developing an infection that turned his hand black. Efficiency metrics dictated replacement before full personnel loss. Tam arrived during the height of the Pump 4 crisis. He was younger than most new assignments, 16, maybe 17. He still had fat on his frame, which meant he had come from a section with better ration distribution. Possibly one of the mid-deck maintenance zones, where the temperature was slightly higher and the metabolic load slightly lower. He did not complain about the cold, which demonstrated prior conditioning. He followed instructions precisely, then assigned him to me because I had the most experience with Pump 4's internal architecture. I was 20 years old by then. Old enough to train new personnel. Old enough that my hands were scarred and 2 of my fingers were shorter than they should be. Lost to frostbite and amputation, but not so old that I had begun to slow down. I was at peak operational efficiency. Tam was my responsibility. I taught him the bearing access sequence first. Pump 4's main bearing assembly was housed behind 6 layers of pressure seals, each one requiring a specific sequence of bolt removal. Remove them in the wrong order, and the pressure differential would blow the seals outward with enough force to take your head off. I showed him the sequence once. He watched. I made him repeat it back to me verbally. He did. Then I made him perform it with the pump depressurized. He did. Perfectly. I logged him as competent in bearing access. The seal replacement procedure was more complex. The seals themselves were ancient composite materials that had become brittle over centuries of thermal cycling. You had to remove them without breaking them, because broken seals left fragments that would contaminate the bearing lubricant and cause cascading failures. Tam had good hands. Steady. Patient. He worked slowly, which was correct. Speed caused mistakes. Mistakes caused deaths. I watched him remove his first seal. It took him 40 minutes. The seal came out intact. I told him it was acceptable work. He almost smiled. Almost. The expression died before it fully formed. The lower decks teach you not to smile. We worked together on Pump 4 for 30 shifts, then 40, then 60. The repair expanded as we discovered additional damage deeper in the system. The catastrophic seal failure had been a symptom, not the cause. The primary coolant jacket had stress fractures. The impeller shaft had developed harmonic vibration that was degrading the mounting brackets. The entire pump needed to be disassembled, inspected, repaired, and reassembled. It was the largest maintenance operation I had been part of. Venn assigned other personnel as needed, but Tam remained with me. He was efficient. We developed rhythm. I would call out the next tool required. He would hand it to me before I finished the sentence. Communication became minimal. Work became smooth. I noticed things about him. The way he would blow on his hands to warm them before gripping metal tools. The way he would count bolt threads under his breath to ensure proper tension. The way he would stand closer to the pump housing than strictly necessary, stealing warmth from the machinery. Small details. Irrelevant details. I noticed them anyway. He had a scar on his left forearm, a perfectly straight line 6 centimeters long, surgical, not accidental. Someone had cut him deliberately, probably for medical access. I never asked about it. He never mentioned it. During shift 206 of that year's cycle, I had started keeping more precise counts by then, scratching marks into the frost on the bulkhead near my sleeping station. Tam asked me about the upper sections. Had I seen them? I confirmed. He asked what they were like. I described the light and the painted walls. He processed this silently for most of a shift. We worked. We removed corroded bolts and catalogued them for reclamation. We installed replacement seals. We tested pressure tolerances. He said nothing. Then he stopped working, just stopped. He was holding a wrench, staring at Pump 4's main housing. He said, "Do you think the officers know we exist?" I had no data to answer that question. I thought about the officer who had walked past me in the upper corridor without seeing me. I thought about the distribution system that failed without explanation and resumed without apology. I thought about the fact that in 20 years, I had never received a direct communication from anyone above our deck level. I told him the truth. Operationally, it does not matter. He looked at me then, actually looked at me, not just in my direction but at me. He said, "It matters to me." I did not know what to say. The statement made no sense within the framework I had been taught. What mattered was function. What mattered was the pump. What mattered was staying useful enough to receive rations. Whether the officers acknowledged our existence had no bearing on any of those things. I told him this. He said, "I know, but it matters anyway." We returned to work. The conversation ended, but something had shifted. I became aware of Tam in a way I had not been aware of anyone since Venn had first taught me pump maintenance. I noticed when he was absent. I listened for his voice in the dark. When he was injured, a scalding burn from a coolant line rupture that caught him across the right shoulder. I diverted my own rations to him for 3 shifts while he healed. 60 grams each shift. 180 grams total. I felt the hunger sharpen during those shifts, but I did not reconsider the decision. No one commented. Venn logged it. He did not intervene. I think Venn understood before I did. The shaking is the only time we experience the war. I did not understand this for years. The ship exists to fight. That much was clear from the architecture. The weapons systems we occasionally glimpsed in restricted sections during maintenance calls to adjacent territories. The constant drills that would sound through the upper decks and never reach us. But in the lower decks, combat was abstract, theoretical, something that happened to other people in other places, until the hull shook. The first time I experienced it, I was 8 years old and working with Ven on bilge pump 12. The deck lurched, not violently but noticeably. The pump rhythm stuttered. Every man in the section froze. Ven grabbed a support strut and waited. The shaking continued. 15 seconds. 20. I felt it in my chest, a vibration that made my teeth ache. Then it stopped. The pump rhythm resumed. Ven released the strut and returned to work. He said only, "Weapons discharge. Aft batteries." I did not understand what that meant. Weapons discharge. Aft batteries. The words had no context. But over the years, I learned to distinguish the patterns. The deep, rolling shudder of the main lance batteries. Massive energy weapons that drew so much power the lights would dim even in the lower decks. The rapid staccato of torpedo launches. 16 individual jolts in quick succession, each one accompanied by a pressure change you could feel in your sinuses. The violent, wrenching jolt that meant the ship had been hit. That last one was rare. When it happened, you stopped working and you held onto something bolted to the deck. If the structural integrity failed in the lower sections, you died. There was no evacuation protocol. There were no escape systems. You simply ceased. The worst was the sustained shaking. It meant fleet engagement, hours of continuous weapons fire, maneuvering, impact. During those periods, the temperature would drop even further as power was diverted to shields and weapons. The pumps would run on minimal cycling. We would huddle near the warmest sections and wait. Men died during the sustained engagements, not from violence, from the cold and the fear, and the understanding that every jolt might be the one that breached the hull. You could not work during sustained engagement. You could only endure. Tam experienced his first sustained engagement during his 3rd month in our section. It lasted 9 hours. The shaking was so constant that tools vibrated off their racks. The condensation frost shattered and fell like snow. Temperature dropped to 14 degrees. Men began shaking uncontrollably. Ven ordered everyone to the pump 12 housing. We pressed against the warm metal and waited. Tam sat against the housing with his arms wrapped around his knees. He did not speak. I sat next to him because proximity to another body conserved heat. The shaking continued. An hour, 2 hours, 3. You lost track. Time became measured in jolts. After the 4th hour, Tam said, "Are we going to die?" I answered honestly. Eventually. He almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught in his throat and came out wrong, a kind of choking noise that might have been humor or might have been panic. He said, "I meant now." I told him I had no data to predict that. The ship had survived sustained engagements before. The lower decks had not breached. Probability suggested we would survive this one, but probability was not certainty. Men had died in previous engagements. Deck Tertiary 9-8 had lost 6 personnel when a support beam collapsed during the particularly violent impact. We might die, we might not. I could not calculate the odds with any accuracy. Tam pressed harder against the pump housing. His shoulder touched mine. The contact was warm. He said, "If we die, will anyone know?" I understood what he was asking. Would the officers know? Would anyone in the upper sections register our deaths? Would there be a record beyond the gang's internal accounting? I said, "No." He said, "That seems wrong." I had no response to that. Wrong implied a standard against which to measure outcomes. Wrong implied that things could be different. Wrong implied that the universe cared about fairness. I had no evidence for any of those propositions. The universe was cold metal and darkness, and the rhythm of pumps. That was all. Tam's feelings about the fairness of anonymous death did not change the operational reality of anonymous death. But I did not say that. I said nothing. We sat together against the warm housing while the ship shook around us. After 9 hours, the engagement ended. The shaking stopped. The pumps resumed normal cycling. Temperature began to rise back to 18 degrees. We returned to work. Tam stayed close to me after that. Not physically. Space in the lower decks was too limited for personal proximity. But operationally. He requested assignment to my work rotations. He slept in the bunk adjacent to mine, a shelf of metal 18 inches wide, welded to the bulkhead. When distribution occurred, he would wait for me to collect my ration before collecting his, even though there was no tactical reason to do so. We fell into pattern. Work, ration, sleep, work. The cycles blurred. Tam became the constant. When I woke, he was there. When I worked, he was there. When the hull shook and men braced for death, he was there. I began to structure my awareness around his presence. I would calculate his position relative to mine during maintenance operations. I would listen for his breathing in the sleeping corridor to confirm he was alive. I would observe his ration consumption to ensure he was maintaining adequate caloric intake. These were not required behaviors. They were not efficient. I did them anyway. I did not have a word for what he became. The lower decks do not teach language for attachment. You have gang members, work partners, territorial allies. You do not have friends. Friendship implies choice, and choice implies freedom, and freedom does not exist at 31 degrees with 200 grams of protein every 8 shifts. But Tam was... he mattered. More than efficiency metrics suggested he should. I noticed when he was absent. The architecture of my awareness had changed to include him as a permanent fixture, like the rhythm of the pumps or the cold. He was part of the baseline. I think Venn understood before I did. During a routine maintenance briefing, he assigned Tam and me to a secondary coolant inspection that required only one person. I started to question the assignment. Venn looked at me and said, "You work better together. Efficiency is acceptable." That was the end of the discussion. Venn had seen the pattern I had not yet acknowledged. 2 people working in rhythm produced better outcomes than 2 people working separately. The gang benefited from keeping us together. So we stayed together. Months passed, then a year. Tam grew leaner as his body adapted fully to lower deck rations. His hands developed the same scars mine had. 2 of his fingers turned black from frostbite one cycle, and I had to amputate them with a heated blade. He did not scream. He bit down on a rag and let me work. Afterward, he looked at his hand, 8 fingers now instead of 10, and said, "Same as you." He almost smiled. I had lost the same 2 fingers on the same hand. We matched. Now, work continued. Pump 4 was fully operational. Pump 7 developed a minor leak that we corrected in 3 shifts. Pump 12 continued its eternal rhythm, outliving us all. Tam and I fell into a pattern so smooth, it felt like we had always worked together. He would start a sentence, and I would finish it. I would reach for a tool, and he would hand it to me. We communicated in fragments and gestures. Full sentences became unnecessary. During shift 418, I remember the exact count because I had scratched it into the bulkhead that morning. Tam said, "If I die, will you remember me?" We were working on Pump 7's secondary intake valve. The question came out of nowhere. No context, no preamble. I stopped working. I looked at him. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the valve housing wrench in hand, waiting for my answer. I said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" I had no answer to that. Memory degraded over time. Details corrupted. I had tried to remember my mother's face, and failed. I had tried to remember the exact temperature of the upper corridor, and could not retrieve the data with accuracy. Memory was not permanent. Eventually, Tam would fade the same way everyone faded. I would retain fragments. The scar on his arm, the sound of his voice, the efficiency of his hands, but the whole person would degrade into archived data, corrupted and incomplete. I told him the truth. "I do not know." He nodded. He returned to work. The conversation ended, but the question stayed with me. It created a weight I had not experienced before. The understanding that Tam was temporary, that everyone was temporary, that the ship would outlive us all and would not remember any of it. The pumps would continue. New men would arrive. The cycle would repeat. Tam and I were components in a system that would replace us without notation. I found this knowledge difficult to process. The change began during shift 607. I noticed it in the temperature first. The readings from Pump 12's housing had dropped 3 degrees over the course of 2 shifts. Not a catastrophic decline, but significant enough to warrant investigation. I reported it to Ven. He assigned Tam and me to trace the thermal regulation system and identify the cause. We started at the pump and worked backward through the heat exchange network. The lower decks maintained their barely habitable temperature through waste heat reclamation. The pumps generated thermal energy as a byproduct of their operation, and that heat was captured and distributed through a labyrinth of ducts and exchange coils. When the system functioned correctly, the section stayed at 18 to 31 degrees. When it malfunctioned, men froze. Tam and I followed the primary exchange line through 6 sections. The temperature dropped as we moved away from the pump. 16 degrees, 14, 12. We were wearing every layer we owned. Our breath came out in clouds so thick we could barely see. I felt my fingers going numb inside my gloves. Tam's lips had turned blue, but we continued. Stopping meant failure. Failure meant the temperature would continue to drop. Men would die. We found the problem in section tertiary 9-4, a territory controlled by one of the coolant line gangs. A primary exchange coil had ruptured. Coolant was spraying into the air and freezing instantly, forming a cascade of ice that blocked the entire duct. The heat that should have been flowing to our section was venting directly into the void through a microscopic hull breach, not large enough to cause decompression, large enough to kill us slowly. Tam looked at the rupture. He looked at me. He said, "This is going to take days." I confirmed. The coil would need to be isolated, drained, removed, replaced. The hull breach would need to be patched from the inside. We would need materials we did not have. We would need permission to access another gang's territory for an extended period. We would need Ven to negotiate with the coolant gang leadership. And while all of that was being arranged, the temperature in our section would continue to drop. I started back toward tertiary 9-7 to report. Tam stayed behind. He said he would start the preliminary work, cataloging the damage, measuring the breach, identifying exactly which materials we would need. I told him not to stay too long. 12 degrees would kill him if he remained stationary. He said he understood. I left. The walk back took 40 minutes. By the time I reached Ven, I could barely feel my feet. I delivered the report. Ven processed it silently, then sent 2 men to negotiate with the coolant gang. He told me to rest for 1 shift, then return with a full repair team. I went to my bunk. Tam's bunk next to mine was empty. I lay down, and waited for the shaking in my hands to stop. Tam did not return that shift, or the next. By the third shift, I went back to section tertiary 9-4. The coolant gang had granted access. 4 men from our gang were already working on the coil isolation. Tam was there. He had not left. He had been working alone in 12-degree cold for 3 shifts. His face was grey. His movements were slow. I could see him shaking even from a distance. I approached and put my hand on his shoulder. He looked at me. His eyes were not focusing correctly. Hypothermia. Advanced stage. I needed to get him back to warmth immediately. I told him to come with me. He said, "The measurements are complete. I have the full damage assessment. We can start fabrication of the replacement coil as soon as materials arrive." His words were slurred. He was not processing correctly. I told him again to come with me. He said, "I need to finish the breach analysis first." I did not ask. I grabbed him. He tried to resist, but he had no strength. I hauled him back toward tertiary 9-7, half carrying him through the access corridors. He kept trying to tell me about stress tolerances and thermal coefficients. I did not listen. I was counting his breaths. They were too shallow, too slow. We reached pump 12. I pressed him against the housing. 40-degree metal against his frozen body. He gasped. The warmth was painful after prolonged cold. I held him there. His shaking intensified as his body tried to generate heat. I stayed next to him, maintaining pressure so he could not pull away from the housing. After 20 minutes, his shaking began to subside. After 40, he stopped trying to talk about the repair. After an hour, his eyes focused. He looked at me and said, "I was going to finish it." I said, "You were going to die." He said, "The section needs heat." I said, "The section needs you functional." That was not entirely accurate. The section needed pump maintenance personnel. Tam was 1 unit of labor among 16. He was replaceable within the gang's operational framework, but I needed him functional. I did not say that part. I did not have language for that part. Tam recovered over the next 2 shifts. The repair team completed the coil isolation without him. Materials arrived from the fabrication section. Another gang's territory. Another set of negotiations. The replacement coil was installed over 8 shifts. The hull breach was patched. Heat flow resumed. Temperature in our section rose back to 18 degrees. Operations returned to normal. Tam returned to work. I watched him more carefully after that. I noted when he pushed himself too hard. I noted when he skipped rest shifts to complete repairs. I noted when he diverted portions of his rations to other gang members who were injured or sick. I began intervening. I would order him to rest. I would ensure he consumed his full ration allotment. I would physically remove him from work sites when his efficiency metrics declined. He resisted at first. Then he stopped resisting. He adapted to my interventions the way you adapt to the cold. It became part of the pattern. Venn observed this. During a routine maintenance briefing, he said, "You are managing Tam's operational capacity more than your own." I confirmed. He asked if this was affecting my efficiency. I told him it was not. He said, "See that it does not." That was the extent of his concern. As long as the work was completed, the internal dynamics of the labor units did not matter. But something had changed. I had developed a priority structure that placed Tam's survival above optimal work output. This was inefficient. This was illogical. This was not correctable. I had tried to process him as just another gang member, just another set of hands maintaining the pumps. I could not. He had become weight. He had become the thing I measured other things against. The sustained engagements were increasing in frequency. Once every 6 months became once every 3 months, then once every month. The war, whatever war the ship was fighting, wherever that war was happening, was intensifying. We experienced this as longer periods of shaking, deeper drops in temperature, more frequent power fluctuations. The pumps would cycle down to minimum operational capacity for hours at a time. We would wait in the darkness, pressed against warm metal, counting jolts. Tam and I developed a protocol during engagements. When the shaking started, we would move to pump 12 immediately. We would position ourselves on the north side of the housing, where a structural support created a small alcove that provided additional protection. We would sit with our backs against the metal, shoulders touching for warmth. We would wait. During one engagement, I had stopped counting them individually. They had become too frequent. The shaking was particularly violent. The lights failed completely. The emergency lighting failed. We were in absolute darkness. The only sensory input was the vibration through the deck plating, the rhythm of pump 12 against our backs, and the sound of our own breathing. Tam's hand found mine in the dark. He did not say anything. He just held on. His hand was cold. I held back. We sat like that for 3 hours while the ship fought something we would never see, never understand, never be briefed on. The engagement ended. The lights resumed. Tam released my hand. We returned to work. Neither of us mentioned it. But it kept happening. Every engagement, his hand would find mine. Every time I would hold back. It became part of the protocol. Engagements meant darkness and shaking, and Tam's hand in mine, holding on like I was the only fixed point in a universe that was trying to shake itself apart. I began to understand what he had meant when he said the officers' awareness mattered to him. Not because their awareness changed anything operationally, but because existence without witness felt like a particular kind of death. We lived and worked and would eventually die in absolute obscurity. The ship would not remember us. The Imperium would not remember us. We were components with no serial numbers, labor with no designation beyond our gang affiliation. When we died, we would be replaced, and the replacement would be replaced, and the cycle would continue until the ship itself finally failed. But Tam witnessed me. I witnessed Tam. That was something. That was not nothing. Time continued. Shifts accumulated. I stopped scratching counts into the bulkhead because the numbers had become too large to matter. I estimated I was 24 years old. Tam would be 21. Old by lower deck standards. Most men did not survive past 30. The cold and the hunger and the constant exposure to toxic coolant compounds degraded the body faster than it could repair itself. You wore out. You stopped being efficient. You went to reclamation. I had observed this process in others. Ven was 37 years old, the oldest man in our section. His hands shook even when he was not cold. His breathing was labored. He had developed a cough that never fully cleared. He was wearing out. He knew it. We all knew it. But he continued working because work was all there was. When he could no longer work, he would go to reclamation. That was the protocol. That was how it ended for everyone. I thought about this often now. I thought about Tam going to reclamation. I thought about holding his hand during an engagement and feeling it go cold permanently. I thought about standing at the reclamation chute and feeding him into the system that would break down his body into protein blocks that would be distributed to the next generation of labor. The thought created something I had no proper words for. Not fear. Fear implied uncertainty. This was certainty. Tam would die. I would die. The question was only the sequence and the timing. I asked him once, during a rest shift, if he was afraid of dying. We were lying in our bunks, 18 inches apart, close enough to hear each other breathe. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Not of dying, of being forgotten." I understood. Death was operational reality. Everyone died. But being forgotten meant you had never mattered. Your existence had been functionally equivalent to non-existence. You had been fuel, component, protein, nothing more. I said, "I will remember you." He said, "Until you die." I said, "Yes." He said, "And then no one will remember either of us." I had no response to that. It was accurate. We would both be forgotten. We would vanish into the ship's history, without trace, without record, without witness. Future generations would maintain the same pumps, sleep in the same bunks, freeze in the same cold, and never know we had existed. Tam said, "I wish there was something permanent. Something that would last after we are gone." I said, "The pumps will last." He said, "That is not what I mean." I knew what he meant. He meant something of us, something that demonstrated we had been people, not components, something that would testify to our existence after we were gone. But there was nothing like that. The lower decks did not accommodate permanent records. We had no writing materials beyond grease pencils that faded. We had no way to store data. We had nothing but our labor and our bodies, and the brief span of time between birth and reclamation. I said, "There is nothing permanent." He said, "I know." We lay in silence after that. I listened to him breathe. The rhythm was steady, regular. He was still alive, still functional. That would have to be enough. The deterioration of section tertiary 9-7 began during shift 1040. I remember the number because it was the day Venn went to reclamation. His cough had worsened over the previous month. He could no longer perform heavy maintenance. His hands shook so badly he could not grip tools reliably. During a routine bearing replacement, he collapsed. We carried him to Pump 12's housing, but the warmth did not help. His breathing was wrong, wet, labored. He knew. He looked at me and said, "You are senior maintenance now. The gang is yours." I started to refuse. He stopped me. He said, "You know the pumps better than anyone. Tam knows them second best. You two will keep the section operational." He coughed. Blood came up. He wiped it away and continued. "The system continues. You continue it." We helped him to the reclamation chute. He walked the last few meters himself. He stood at the edge and looked back at us. He said, "It was enough." Then he stepped forward and was gone. I became gang leader by default, not by choice, not by ambition, by being the one who survived longest. The gang had 14 members now. I knew all their names. I knew their efficiency ratings. I knew which ones were reliable and which ones would make mistakes under pressure. I knew who would survive another 5 years and who would die within 6 months. I reorganized work assignments based on optimal efficiency. I established new protocols for ration reserves. I continued what Venn had built because that was the function I had been assigned. Tam became my second. Not officially. There were no official designations in the lower decks, but functionally. He handled the crew scheduling while I managed the repair priorities. He monitored tool inventory while I negotiated with other gangs for materials. We split the leadership functions the same way we had split maintenance work. Smoothly, efficiently, without discussion. But the weight increased. I was now responsible not just for my own survival, not just for Tam's survival, but for 14 men whose continued existence depended on my decisions. When I assigned someone to a dangerous repair, I was calculating the probability of their death. When I allocated rations, I was deciding who would have the reserves to survive the next distribution failure. When I sent someone into 12-degree cold to trace a thermal fault, I was potentially sending them to freeze the way Tam nearly had. I understood now why then had been the way he was. Distant, clinical, treating us as operational units rather than individuals. Attachment was weight. Weight degraded efficiency. If you allowed yourself to see the men as people, you would hesitate. Hesitation caused failures. Failures caused deaths. The only way to lead was to process them as components. Valuable components, worth maintaining. But components nonetheless. I could not do this with Tam. I tried. I attempted to process him as senior maintenance personnel, functionally valuable but ultimately replaceable. I could not. He remained weight. He remained the center of my awareness. When I assigned him to a repair, I would calculate the risk factors 3 times instead of once. When he was late returning from a work site, I would experience something that felt like system malfunction. A tight sensation in my chest, accelerated heart rate, inability to focus on other tasks until he returned. This was inefficient. This was dangerous. This would eventually compromise my decision-making. I knew this. I continued anyway. The ship's engagements were now constant. We would experience shaking for 6 hours, get 12 hours of stability, then shaking would resume. The war had intensified to the point where the ship appeared to be in continuous combat. Temperature in our section averaged 14 degrees now. The pumps ran on minimum cycling. Power was being diverted almost entirely to weapons and shields. We were freezing slowly. Men began dying more frequently. Not from accidents, from the cold. They would go to sleep and not wake up. Their metabolic systems would shut down. Their hearts would stop. I would find them in the morning, frosted over, already rigid. I would log them, strip them, feed them to reclamation, add their rations to the reserves, assign new personnel to their work rotations, continue operations. I lost 4 men in 2 months, then 6 men in the next month. The gang was down to 8 personnel. I requested replacements from the distribution authority. None arrived. The upper sections were apparently experiencing their own labor shortages. We were expected to maintain operational capacity with diminishing personnel. I redistributed work assignments. Tam and I began working double shifts to cover the gaps. We slept 4 hours out of every 24. We consumed our rations and kept working. There was no alternative. During this period, I observed Tam beginning to deteriorate. Not catastrophically, not in ways that would be obvious to others. But I knew him. I knew the exact rhythm of his breathing. I knew how many times he would shift position during a rest period. I knew the precise force with which he would tighten a bolt. These patterns were changing. His breathing was becoming shallower. He was shifting position more frequently, trying to find warmth that did not exist. His bolt tension was becoming inconsistent. Sometimes too tight, sometimes not tight enough. He was wearing out. I increased his ration allocation from my own reserves. He noticed. He told me to stop. I did not stop. He argued. I told him it was a command decision, not a discussion. As gang leader, I determined ration distribution based on operational priority. He was senior maintenance. He required additional calories. He accepted this explanation even though we both knew it was not accurate. The truth was, I could not process the concept of him wearing out. I could not tolerate the thought of him going to reclamation. So I gave him my rations and accepted the hunger and did not discuss it further. The longest engagement began on shift 1318. The shaking started during a work period and did not stop. 6 hours became 12. 12 became 24. We abandoned work and went to pump 12. All 8 of us pressed against the housing, stealing what warmth we could. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. Men were losing consciousness. I was losing track of time. Tam was next to me. His hand was in mine. Had been for hours. I could barely feel it anymore. My fingers were numb. His fingers were numb. But we held on. The shaking was so violent, the tools were being thrown from racks. Sections of frost were breaking off the bulkheads and shattering on the deck. The ship was being torn apart around us, or we were tearing something else apart. I had no way to know which. 48 hours into the engagement, one of the men died, just stopped breathing. We could not move him to reclamation during the shaking. We left him there. 72 hours in, another man died, then a third. We were down to 5. Tam was unconscious now, still breathing, still alive. But his body had shut down all non-essential functions. I kept my hand on his chest to monitor his heart rate, still beating. Slow, too slow, but beating. I thought, if he dies here, I will not be able to move his body to reclamation until the engagement ends. I will have to sit next to his corpse until the shaking stops. The thought was not acceptable. I needed him to continue breathing. I needed his heart to continue beating. I focused on that. I counted his heartbeats. I matched my breathing to his breathing. I held on to him like I could transfer my own metabolic function into his body through proximity and will. The engagement lasted 96 hours, 4 days of continuous shaking. When it finally stopped, 5 of us were still alive. 3 were dead. Tam was unconscious but breathing. I checked the others. 2 were functional. 1 was borderline. I organized them into a recovery protocol. Stay at the housing. Consume rations slowly to avoid shock. Rest. I would handle everything else. I carried the 3 dead men to reclamation myself. 1 trip per body. My legs were not functioning correctly. I fell twice. I completed the task. I returned to pump 12. Tam had regained consciousness. He looked at me. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He said, "You should have let me go." I said, "No." He said, "I am not efficient anymore. I am weight." I said, "You are necessary." He started to argue. I stopped him. I said, "You are necessary to me. That is all the justification required." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "That is not how the system works." I said, "I am the system now. I decide how it works." This was not accurate. I was not the system. The system was the ship, the Empyrean, the vast institutional machinery that ground billions of humans into fuel. I was a minor component of that system, functionally irrelevant at every level except the maintenance of 6 bilge pumps in one section of one deck of one ship. But within that narrow domain, I had limited authority. And I was using that authority to keep Tam alive. Efficiency be damned. He understood. He said nothing else. He consumed his ration. He slept. I sat next to him and monitored his breathing until I was certain it had stabilized. We had lost 3 men. Replacements did not arrive. The gang was 5 personnel now. This was not sustainable. You needed minimum 6 personnel to maintain continuous pump operations across 3 shift cycles. With 5, someone had to work double shifts every rotation. That someone was me. I worked 18-hour shifts. I slept 3 hours. I consumed my rations and Tam's surplus. He was eating even less now, saving portions for me despite my orders to the contrary, and continued working. I lasted 4 months like this. Then my body began failing. I noticed it first in my hands. They were not responding to neural commands correctly. I would tell my hand to grip a wrench. There would be a delay. Then the grip would be too weak or too strong. My fine motor control was degrading. Then my vision started failing. I would experience moments where everything would go dark for 2 or 3 seconds, then return, then go dark again. My body was shutting down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. I was dying, slowly, but dying. Tam noticed. He said, "You need to reduce your shift hours." I said, "Cannot. Not enough personnel." He said, "Then you need to request emergency reassignments." I said, "Already requested. None available." He said, "Then we need to reduce operational scope." I said, "Cannot. If the pumps fail, the section floods, everyone dies." He said, "If you die, everyone dies anyway." This was accurate. I was the only one with complete knowledge of all 6 pumps. Tam knew 4 of them. The other 3 personnel knew 1 or 2 each. If I died, the knowledge died with me. The gang would lose efficiency. Failures would cascade. The section would die. I needed to transfer my knowledge to Tam before I became non-functional. I started recording everything I knew, not in writing. We had no permanent recording materials, but verbally. During rest shifts, I would describe every pump system in exhaustive detail. Tam would listen and repeat it back to me to confirm retention. We did this for weeks. I would describe bearing sequences and seal tolerances and thermal coefficients and failure indicators. He would memorize. We were archiving my knowledge into his mind before mine degraded. During shift 1647, while I was describing the secondary coolant bypass procedure for pump 12, I lost consciousness mid-sentence. I woke up in my bunk. Tam was sitting next to me. He said, "You were unconscious for 4 hours. Your heart stopped twice." I restarted it. I asked how. He showed me chest compressions, a procedure he had learned from someone in his previous section. He had brought me back. "Twice," I said. "If my heart stops a 3rd time, do not restart it." He said, "No." I said, "That is an order." He said, "I do not care." I tried to argue. He interrupted me. He said, "You kept me alive when I should have died. I am returning the favor. We are even now. But I am not letting you go to reclamation while there is anything I can do to prevent it." I said, "This is inefficient." He said, "I know." I said, "This is not how the system works." He said, "You said you were the system. I am using your precedent." I had no response to that. He had taken my own logic and used it against me. We were both now operating outside the established protocols. We were both prioritizing each other's survival over optimal efficiency. We were both weight to each other. We were both drowning together. I said, "We are going to die." He said, "Yes, but not today." He was right. Not that day, but soon. In fact, I recovered enough to resume light maintenance work. Tam took over the heavy operations. The other 3 personnel covered the routine monitoring. We were functional, barely. The section continued. The pumps continued. We continued. But I was aware now that I was living on borrowed time. My body was not repairing itself anymore. Each day, I degraded slightly further. Vision failures became more frequent. My hands shook constantly now, the way Ven's had. I was 30 years old, maybe 31. Old, worn out. The system was preparing to reclaim me. Tam was 24, younger, stronger. He would survive me. This was acceptable. He would continue the gang. He would maintain the pumps. The section would survive. That was all that mattered. Except, it was not all that mattered. I found that I cared deeply about what happened after I went to reclamation. I cared that Tam would be alone. I cared that he would have to stand at the chute and watch me step forward the way I had watched Ven. I cared that he would continue working and sleeping and breathing without me there. This caring was irrational. Once I was dead, my consciousness would not exist to process any of it. What happened after should be irrelevant. But it was not irrelevant. It mattered to me that Tam would grieve. It mattered that I would cause him pain by dying. It mattered that I could not prevent this. During shift 1793, I told Tam that when I went to reclamation, he should not stay to watch. He should return to work immediately. Process it as a standard personnel transition. Log it and move forward. He listened. Then he said, "I will not do that." I said, "It is easier if you do not watch." He said, "I do not want it to be easier. I want to witness it. You will not die without witness." I understood then what he was doing. He was giving me what I could not give my mother, what Ven could not have, what billions of men in the lower decks never received. Witness. Someone who would acknowledge that my existence had mattered. Someone who would remember, even if only for a little while, even if only until he died too. It was not permanent, but it was something. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You do not need to thank me. This is what I am for." We sat in silence after that. My shift was ending. I was supposed to sleep. I did not want to sleep. I wanted to stay conscious, stay aware, preserve every remaining moment. But my body was failing. I could not prevent it. I lay down in my bunk. Tam lay down in his, 18 inches away, close enough to hear each other breathe. I listened to his breathing. Regular, steady. The rhythm was calming. I matched my breathing to his. I said, "Tam." He said yes. I said, "You mattered." He said, "You matter." Present tense, not past. I was still alive, still functional, still here. I wanted to tell him everything I had no words for. I wanted to explain that he had become the architecture of my existence, that I measured time in his heartbeats, that the cold was bearable because he was in it with me, that dying would be acceptable if I knew he would continue. But I had no language for any of it. The lower decks had not taught me how to say these things. So I said, "I will remember you." He said, "I know." I closed my eyes. I listened to him breathe. The rhythm continued. 4 beats, pause. 4 beats. Like the pumps. Like the ship. Like everything that continued when individual components failed. I let the rhythm carry me into unconsciousness. I woke up. Another shift, I continued. This is how it continues now. I am 32 years old. My heart stops occasionally. Tam restarts it. My vision fails for longer periods. My hands shake too much to perform fine work, but I continue. Tam is 26, still functional, still efficient, still here. The gang has 3 personnel now. We requested replacements. None arrived. We maintain 4 of the 6 pumps. The other 2 run on automated cycling. It is not optimal, but it is sufficient. The engagements are constant now. We live at pump 12. We work when the shaking allows. We endure when it does not. Men die. We log them. New men do not arrive. The section is dying slowly. But it continues. We continue. I do not know how much longer I will remain functional. Weeks, maybe months. My body is eating itself. But I wake up each shift, and Tam is there and the pumps are running, and that is enough. That has to be enough. I think about what Tam asked me years ago. Do the officers know we exist? I have concluded that they do not. We are too far below their awareness. We are decimal points in casualty reports. We are line items in logistics manifests. We are not people to them. We are not even components. We are simply assumed. The ship floats, therefore the pumps work, therefore someone maintains them. The chain of assumptions extends downward until it reaches us, freezing in the dark, holding the machinery together with damaged hands and failing bodies. And I have concluded that Tam was right. It does matter, not operationally, not efficiently, but it matters that someone witnesses. It matters that I know Tam exists. It matters that he knows I exist. It matters that when I die, he will remember me until he dies. It matters that I am recording this testimony now, speaking it into the darkness, preserving it in the only way available to me, in memory, in pattern, in the rhythm of words that might survive me. The Imperium consumes. This is its function. It requires vast amounts of human labor converted into operational capacity. It requires men in the freezing dark keeping pumps running, so ships can fight wars we will never understand against enemies we will never see. It requires us to die in obscurity, unmourned and unremembered, replaced by the next generation, who will die the same way. I do not hate this. Hate requires believing things could be different. Things could not be different. The scale is too vast. The machinery is too entrenched. One man cannot change the Imperium, any more than one man can change the temperature of the void. You can only continue. You can only function until you cannot function anymore. You can only hold the wrench and turn the bolt and keep the machines running, because if you stop, everyone dies. But within that system, within that vast, indifferent machinery, there are still moments that matter. Tam's hand in mine during the shaking, his breathing in the dark, the knowledge that when I stop functioning, someone will notice, someone will care, someone will remember, even briefly, even incompletely, that I existed. That is all I will ever have. It is enough. It has to be enough. The pumps continue their rhythm. 4 beats, pause. 4 beats. I continue my rhythm. Wake, work, rest, repeat. Tam continues his rhythm next to mine. The ship continues its war. The Imperium continues its consumption. And somewhere in the frozen darkness of deck tertiary 97, 2 men hold on to each other and hold on to the machinery and continue existing for as long as the system permits. When my heart stops the next time, Tam will restart it if he can. If he cannot, he will stand at the reclamation chute and watch me go. He will remember me for a while, until his own memory corrupts, until his own body fails, until he stands at the same chute and steps forward into the same darkness. And then, no one will remember either of us. The pumps will outlive our memory. The ship will outlive the pumps. The Imperium will outlive the ship. And none of it will remember that we were here, that we mattered, that we held on. But we did. We were here. We mattered to each other. And for however long my consciousness continues to process these thoughts, that will remain true. It was enough. It is enough. I exist now. Tam exists now. The space between us is warm. The cold cannot take that away.